The problem with sexual disenchantment is that people don't actually behave as if sexual disenchantment is true, because people actually don't feel sexual disenchantment to be true. That's probably also true for disenchantment of the natural world. You know, we have a deep intuitive feeling that actually sex is special for some reason. And it may be as basic as, you know, that has evolved in us for some reason. There's something adaptive about us believing that sex is special and different from other social interactions. Regardless, that's how human beings feel about it. And if you go around trying to pretend otherwise, you will generally make yourself miserable and make other people miserable.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Re-Enchanting podcast. I am Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
And if this is your first time stumbling upon our podcast, we basically take it as an opportunity to chat to some extremely interesting people about how and if the Christian faith can re-enchant certain elements of culture and society. We are part of Seen and Unseen, so do find us there along with all of their other content. And we are joined today by Louise Perry. We're so excited.
Very excited. Thank you.
Excited. Just a little disclaimer from the top that we will be talking, quite frankly, I hope, about all things sex and probably a bit of sexual violence as well. So this is your warning that if for any reason this isn't a good time to be indulging in those topics, consider yourselves warned.
Yeah. Louise, welcome along. I'll just give a little rundown of what you do. You can correct any of this if it's in any way outdated. Journalist, author, advocate for women's rights, and your recent book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, I think has been making waves since it was published, perhaps more waves than you anticipated it would make. But essentially it's about the way you changed your mind about parts of the feminist movement and its embrace of sexual freedom and hookup culture and so on. So we're going to be talking about that on the podcast today.
Yeah, I'm very excited. There's the recommendation that I think Julie Bindel gives at the forefront of it. And I think she ends the recommendation by saying, if you're one of those feminists that think that this book isn't for you, give it a go anyway. And I held my hands up. I was one of those. So I'm so excited to dig into some of that with you. But we always start with the same question, because here we are, Lambeth Palace Library, in front of a pretty impressive skyline. So we always start, we ease people in with what books are on your bedside table right now.
So I am currently reading Hags by Victoria Smith.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
From just being published, and Victoria is a Friend, which is all about the demonisation of older women, which is also a theme that I touch on in the book.
Yeah.
I've also, confession, been rereading Harry Potter. I've just finished the third book, and I actually found that I hadn't read it since becoming a mother. And now I find parts of it so much more emotionally affecting than I thought. Wow. Yeah, so much more. Yeah, because I think that, you know how many children's books are about orphans in some capacity, and when you read them as a child, you're like, yeah, whatever, orphans, like, it just kind of rolls off your back. Whereas when you read them as a parent, they just, they really strike you in the heart, or at least they do me. So
yeah, I get the chance as each of my kids has grown up to reread the Narnia stories to them, and so it's a bit of a guilty pleasure of my own, to be able to kind of dig back into them. And I have very similar feelings about some of the stories there. It's a good excuse. So perhaps as I know you've got a fairly new child,
almost two, so we're not yet reading Narnia.
So we're or Harry Potter, I imagine. No. But there, I'm sure you'll get another chance to.
You say, well, let's talk about your work for a second, because so obviously doing homework for this, I thought before we dig into your book, I've seen you called an anti-feminist, a counter-feminist, a new Puritan, an arch-conservative, I think was one, a radical feminist, which is interesting with all the others. So I thought just from the top, I would love to give you an opportunity or if you define yourself, to sort of put your own labels on yourself. Where do you sit right now? And is that static, or actually does that depend on when you're being asked?
I've been called both left-wing and right-wing completely confidently by different,
okay,
which I always think is really interesting, the fact that people can be absolutely certain in one way or another. I mean, in terms of political compass, I'm probably somewhere on the economic left and the cultural right.
Okay.
sometimes called the post-liberal quadrant, which is actually the quadrant where most voters are found, but will most know politicians is to be found. It's basically the most underrepresented quadrant in British politics and in other countries as well. In terms of feminism, I mean, I do call myself a feminist. The term that I've sort of adopted was one coined by Mary Harrington, who's a writer at Unheard, an author and a friend of mine, which is reactionary feminist, which she came out with a few years ago.
Yeah.
And she kind of came out with it as a joke, because obviously it's preempting people who are going to call you a reactionary. So to some extent, it's almost reclaiming the term or having a bit of fun with the term. Yeah. But I also think that it actually describes something interesting and meaningful, which is quite different from, say, being a conservative feminist. Because if you say that you're a conservative feminist, what people will think you want is to just return to the 1950s, the 1950s with capital T and everything. Yeah, sure. Which I actually don't think we should do, because I think the 1950s were a really weird decade for all sorts of reasons, and there are all sorts of dysfunction in that period that I don't think we would want to imitate. And in general, I think trying to sort of imitate any one decade is madness. You're setting yourself up for failure. I think what reactionary feminism does is it has a completely different relationship with the recent past. And it says, look, there are lots of ways in which our contemporary culture is extremely strange compared to how all other people in all other times and places have lived. And there are some elements of that strangeness which make us miserable and which are unsustainable. Our relationship with the natural world, for instance, and the atomization, dislocation that many people are experiencing in contemporary society and so on. These are bad themes. What we can do that is instructive in looking at the past and looking at other cultures is to say, what are the common threads here? And if we don't believe in the progress narrative, if we don't think that history just keeps getting better and better, the arc of the universe bending towards justice, the Martin Luther King phrase, if you don't believe in that, which I don't, then we can start from the premise that actually our ancestors weren't bad and stupid. That they probably had some insight into human beings and the sort of social structures and ideas that actually produce flourishing societies and allow individuals to flourish. And if you can look at those common themes across different societies, you can use that as a guiding principle in understanding what's good for people and what's good for women and what's good for families. So one example I would give is every society has some sort of notion of marriage.
Okay.
It's unheard of, except for us right now, for there to be no formally recognised institution of marriage, which is sort of universally accepted by everyone. That can obviously look like different things. But I think that's a starting point you can go from. You can say, okay, no other society has ever managed to flourish without something like marriage. That suggests we probably can't either.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You say that your experience working at a let me get this dead right, a women's refuge, is that
Rape Crisis Centre.
Rape Crisis Centre, really formed the feminism that you have now. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how formative that was?
It's part of my age, I guess, because I did this straight out of university, so it was that point where you're still learning about the world. I think that anyone who hasn't gone through some sort of ideological shift, normally at about that age, has made an error somewhere, because I think that you ought to change your mind about things. You ought to, anyone who just agrees with absolutely everything that's offered to them as part of the sort of political package of their in-group is probably lying to themselves in some sort of way. So yes, to some extent I was going through that period anyway at that age. And also because it was a confrontation for me, someone who'd been schooled in academic feminism and I'd done women's studies at Oxford and, the real ivory towers stuff. It was a reminder that that's not really what the real world is like, and it didn't really map. The stuff that I had learned in seminars didn't map onto reality.
Okay.
What kind of stuff? What was the specifics of what you were seeing versus the theory that was supposedly explaining the culture or the behaviour that you were coming front with?
So one example is that academic feminism has almost nothing to say about motherhood, and almost nothing to say about actually biology even. That's what I was taught at university had so much to do with gender performance and appearance and representation and all the superficialities of gender, which, if you understand them in those ways, then you can understand them to be easily dissolved through cultural reform. Whereas actually that's not how people live their lives, that the differences actually between the sexes are profound on a physical level in particular. And women and girls who are not part of that academic sphere yes, I remember having to sit down with young women who I was working with and go through some of the crazy forms that we had, asking them whether they were like polysexual and that sort of thing. And obviously these girls had no idea what I was talking about, like this ridiculous jargon that had been invented by the academy. I was just so embarrassed to have to repeat it. So I was already kind of skeptical of a lot of academic feminism, but that was really the nail in the coffin.
Right. I mean, the book, in a sense, came out of your experience of having been schooled in that sort of academic feminism, as you call it, and then the experience of seeing the real life situations in front of you in the Rape Crisis Centre. And the book comes, for those who haven't read it, to, you could argue, surprisingly Christian conclusions in terms of sexual ethics and so on. You basically come out by the end saying there is this thing called marriage and monogamy, and it's the best of the options out there, if you like, for safeguarding women's dignity and value and well-being, essentially, in what is otherwise a very difficult socio-evolutionary kind of package that we get. You weren't writing it from a position of faith. You weren't doing a very sort of socio-evolutionary kind of analysis of the whole thing. Were you kind of surprised at where you eventually landed as you sort of worked those arguments through?
I sort of convinced myself during the writing of the book, actually, because I started off, yes, with more radical feminist ideas, and on many points I do still agree with radical feminism on issues like prostitution and pornography and so on. Where I diverge from a lot of radical feminists is, for instance, on the marriage issue, and in having more respect for some of the traditional institutions in terms of their capacity to protect women's interests and children's interests. I think that what we've seen post-sexual revolution, which obviously coincides perfectly with the process of de-Christianization, which is the same great historical event, really, of the last century, has been a tearing down of those institutions and norms and an attempt to sort of reconstruct society on a new image. And I think that has proved so far to mostly have been a failure and has actually left most of the most vulnerable people worse off, including women and children. I mean, I think that the real losers from the sexual revolution in particular are poor women.
Why so? What are the specifics that you would point to?
Because there are some ways in which women are inherently more vulnerable than men in all times and places. We're smaller physically than men, we're more vulnerable to violence, we get pregnant, which has all, is a joy and a wonder, but also brings with it all sorts of pain and vulnerability. And poor women are particularly vulnerable because of, someone like the sex industry has always been the terrible threat hanging above poor women's heads. And what we've seen post-sexual revolution has not actually been any effort to protect women from that fate. It has instead been a repackaging of it to say that, sex workers work, sex workers empowering, all that kind of liberal gloss over what is actually an ancient form of exploitation and oppression. So I don't think that we've actually, I don't think that this social transformation has done a good job of actually delivering fairness and equality and all of the things that many of its proponents hope for it. I think that it has actually, the phrase that I use in the book is freedom for the pike is death for the minnow. If you just insert greater freedom into a system, if you push the freedom lever, some people will benefit from that. The people who benefit from that are usually actually going to be the people who were already in the strongest position to begin with, who are already in a position to take advantage of these new opportunities that freedom brings with it. And that will sometimes mean exploiting weaker people. The example that I use in the first chapter of the book is Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner. partly because it's a lovely, neat story because they were both born in the same year, and and they spent their lives in LA, most of it, and they're also buried in the same place because Hefner, in his final act of creepiness, beat the crypt next to her.
I didn't know that, and for some reason, when I read that, I found that so, I don't know why, but I found that so creepy. It's like, that really hit me on like on a level that I wasn't expecting.
Particularly given because Hefner, they never actually met in life, but he had the success of Playboy was partly the result of the fact that he had published nudes of Marilyn without her consent in the first issue, that he'd bought from the photographer, but she didn't see a penny, and she was apparently really distressed at this. But this is the thing, though. Hefner was one of these figures who was able to have an absolute ball during the sexual revolution because basically all the limits historically placed on his behaviour, like the expectation of monogamy or whatever, fell away, and the pill arrived on the scene and allowed him to more easily persuade women into bed who might otherwise have been reluctant. And he's a sort of totemic figure in terms of the great beneficiary of the sexual revolution. Unlike, I would say, Marilyn Monroe, who actually lived a fairly miserable life.
You coined the phrase sexual disenchantment, which obviously caught my eye because we're on the Re-Enchanting podcast. It's derived from Max Weber. Can you talk me through exactly what you mean by that term, sexual disenchantment, and how you are seeing that play out?
So I should say I didn't coin the term. I stole the term. From Aaron Sabarian, with his permission, so maybe not stealing. Who's an American writer who wrote a great essay on this some years ago. What Aaron means by the term and the way I use it as well is so taking from Weber's idea of disenchantment of the natural world that proceeds from the Enlightenment, the same sort of process happens as part of the sexual revolution, where previously sex and all the things associated with it, marriage and so on, was enchanted, had a not just a special status, but had a sacred status. And then you have that falling away over the course of the second half of the 20th century until we have this new idea of sex, or the kind of progressive mainstream has a view of sex that it actually doesn't really mean anything, that you can buy it, you can sell it. It's not much different from sort of making someone a cup of coffee, playing tennis with someone or whatever. It's just a kind of neutral social act, which you can imbue with meaning if you want to, but you don't have to. And actually the idea that it does have any kind of specialness or, God forbid, sacredness is anathema to this worldview. The problem with sexual disenchantment is that people don't actually behave as if sexual disenchantment is true, because people actually don't feel sexual disenchantment to be true. That's probably also true for disenchantment of the natural world. We have a deep intuitive feeling that actually sex is special for some reason. And it may be as basic as, that has evolved in us for some reason. There's something adaptive about us believing that sex is special and different from other social interactions. Regardless, that's how human beings feel about it. And if you go around trying to pretend otherwise, you will generally make yourself miserable and make other people miserable. One example of this would be people who try desperately hard to overcome feelings of jealousy in, say, polyamorous community where people are having multiple simultaneous relationships with one another and are trying to do it ethically and are trying to sort of suppress all these natural instincts towards jealousy. It's astonishingly difficult actually to do that. And what normally ends up happening is that people try and it blows up in their faces, and it's actually really rare for people to successfully kind of manage those relationships. Similarly, I would say, particularly for women who are trying to have enjoy casual sex and view hookup culture as just sort of new leisure activity that's suddenly been destigmatized and has been made available to women. It's a very dominant view among feminists and sort of particularly 1990s onwards, which is really the sort of the target of my whole book. There are some women for whom I think they really can enjoy casual sex like that, who can really have sex like a man. So that's the expression used in Sex and the City. But actually the vast majority of women don't really feel like that. And what they will normally end up experiencing is deep instinctive feelings of discomfort and distress, which are very difficult to articulate. Because if you believe in sexual disenchantment, and if you're trying to pretend that actually sex doesn't mean anything, how can you express this? I mean, the only terminology you really have available to you is the terminology of consent. But consent is a very simple binary. It's just a legalistic idea, really. And it's quite possible to consent to something in legal terms, but to not enjoy it, or to be made unhappy long term by it, or to be left with kind of vague feelings of distress, which might be quite hard to articulate. And that is what an enormous number of young women experience in hookup culture, which is the prevailing sexual culture among young people in the 21st century.
I guess to put it brutally, or to put it as if sex isn't unique, then sexual assault isn't unique. But we know that it is. You know, if sex isn't sacred, then rape isn't particularly awful.
Then rape is just theft.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sexual harassment is just...
See that?
Yeah, people don't feel like that.
No, and that's not the way we legally regard it.
No, yeah. So we have codified in law and in certain sort of social ideas that sex is different. And yet we sort of, the sexual disenchantment charade goes on.
Yeah.
I noticed that you mentioned Sex in the City, which was kind of the defining sort of program for, you know, these young women in Manhattan sort of living their best life, free to sleep with whoever they want to sleep with. There's a spin-off series 25 years later that features Sarah Jessica Parker again in Carrie Bradshaw mode, and I haven't seen it. I'll be honest, but I've read a few reviews, and it feels like they're still kind of trying to do the same thing, but at 25 years older. And I felt slightly kind of sad about it, because I felt like, is that life kind of, if you kind of go to that stage and you're still kind of just trying to get something out of, you know, the next person, the next bed that you're hopping into or out of. I don't know. Maybe that's me very much showing my kind of where I come from on this issue. But do you get the sense that Sex in the City attitude is still the prevailing one, or do you feel like culture is starting to turn against that in any way? That sort of maybe seeing that there were some downsides to this as well as, you know, the supposed upsides.
My friend Catherine D, who's a journalist, has an interesting theory about Sex in the City, which is that it was always kind of intended as a joke, as an in-joke. I mean, it is actually funny. We forget this as a comedy. Yeah. But that it was written by and intended for the people in that kind of Manhattan milieu, you know, the people who were materialistic and a bit vain and bed hopping and all this kind of stuff. And it was sort of intended as like a we do these things and we hurt ourselves and sort of poking a bit of fun at the in-group. But it was so enormously successful, no one really got the joke, because people from outside of that world
saw it as glamorous,
read it straight,
some of its own success,
and and saw it as being aspirational. And there are lots of other examples subsequently of that being held up as a really aspirational model. I mean, it's basically women behaving like terrible men, right? It's women behaving like Don Draper, except without even being married, you know, like that, which is always just struck me as a really bizarre kind of basis on which to base any kind of feminist project, to say, well, men have always behaved like Lotharios and, you know, and narcissists and whatever. Women should get a bite of the pie, rather than saying, actually, maybe if men behaved a bit more like women, that would be a better culture. But this is a very deep rooted thing, and seeing masculine ways of doing things, including sexuality, as being aspirational, is very, very deep within modern feminism, and I'd say deep within the culture. And I actually think, I mean, I generally don't use the word patriarchy because I think it isn't very helpful. I mean, in anthropological terms, it obviously has a very clear meaning. A culture where positions of power and authority are exclusively male. We don't actually live in one of those, though. I mean, we did up until relatively recently, but not anymore. We've had a whole bunch of female prime ministers. It's clearly not the case that those sort of positions of power are reserved for men only. But I think that what people often mean when they use the word patriarchy in a much vaguer sense, not in the strict anthropological sense, is a feeling that masculinity is just higher status in a vague kind of way. Like words associated, this is something that Germaine Greer observed many years ago, that words associated with women will often over time become derogatory. So words like mistress or tart, which used to be quite neutral terms, will over time become shameful. Or when professions see an influx of women into them, so teaching would be one example, medicine is now another example right now, you tend to see a drop in status and a drop in pay for those professions. There's something about, and it's hard to pin down and it's hard to know exactly what the cause is, but I think people correctly recognise it to be true, that there is a general feeling that men and masculinity are just a bit more high status. And I think that the trap that some strains of feminism have fallen into is to accept that premise and say, well, in that case, what we want is for women to be more like men. And the problem is that women can't be men for a whole bunch of reasons. And actually women trying to be men normally just makes women more unhappy.
So this is a huge question. If that's not a valid solution, what would you put on the table instead?
Trying to reassert the value of women and of femininity.
Okay.
So, for instance, reasserting the value of motherhood, rather than simply saying that women should be permitted to avoid motherhood at all costs, which is basically what most second-wave feminism has said to this point.
And is that what you feel our current culture is saying, whether obviously or in a kind of subconscious way to women today?
Or explicitly, just a housewife.
Right.
How often do you hear that said about any other, Yes, I think that being... it's not that people it's not misogyny per se. I mean, misogyny is actually quite rare. And true misogynists, there are very few of those. And people don't hate mothers. We all love our moms. And I think the figure of the mother, it's a cultural way, is still prized. But we don't enormously respect them either. And you see this in public policy. I mean, just now we just had the budget come out with enormous sums funneled towards encouraging women back into the workforce, because the work of the home is not considered to be as valuable. Just straightforwardly, the government says so. As
that's not as valuable to the budget.
Yeah, it's not as valuable in terms of tax revenue, and the government doesn't have any way, or hasn't really tried to find any way, of putting a number on the value of mothers looking after their own children, which a lot of women want to do. They do. It's no matter how much we try and persuade women to just behave like men and to go out into the workforce just as men have always, well, not always done, but whatever, just as men do. Poll after poll shows that an enormous number of women still feel this great sort of tug towards the home. And yes, the cultural messaging they receive is that is a flaw in them.
Right. It's interesting because, in a sense, you're saying things that at one level are almost politically incorrect, arguably, in our culture. But you're not saying them because, I don't get the sense, at least, you're saying them because you're some arch conservative who just wants to return to this, some golden era of the 1950s, but because you genuinely feel like, if anything, just from a socio-evolutionary point of view, we can't deny certain aspects of who we are because of our past and the way that we're shaped by all kinds of forces in that sense. What's been the response, though? I mean, are you finding a lot of pushback to this sort of, your own change as the way you look at these things, and what kind of response has the book had as it's done the rounds now?
So much more positive than I thought.
Right.
I really was sort of girding my loins. I thought that this would be... I remember actually in the final weeks before the book was about to be published, I thought, have I just ruined my life? I can't stop it now. It's out there, it's on its way to bookshops as we speak. But actually, it has been enormously positive. Enormously, 95% positive. Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I think what I would say about the book, which is an absolute like grenade of a book, it'll rock your world if you is I think coming at it, and I think none of what you have written comes from a particularly a Christian perspective, which is interesting. I work at Lambeth Palace, so take 3 guesses. I do come from a Christian perspective, and yet I think that I position myself maybe a bit more less conservative, which is really interesting. But I think what I think about the book is read it, because if you disagree with it, it's still an incredibly written book and it's a genuine joy to read. And so it's quite fun to disagree with. But if you agree with it, you need to shout it from the rooftops, because it's what you're doing is in a very bold and very brave way trying to explain. This phrase is coming up a lot on this podcast. Maybe it's me. You're sort of trying to explain water to fish, if you know what I mean, in a really bold way. So it's very much, or you might find yourself thinking a bit of disagreement and a bit of agreement. But either way, I imagine that there's a lot of people who read it who are like genuinely thankful that they feel that you're putting language to what you have already said is are feelings that are hard to put language to.
I've had so many messages of various kinds, or women coming up to me when I've done events or whatever, from young women primarily, or their parents sometimes, who did not know this stuff. I mean, I sort of think the book is actually shockingly obvious. And I do say, like, a couple of times in the book, like, there's nothing really original in here. Like, this is like, I literally have a chapter, a final chapter called "Listen to Your Mother," where I say, look, actually, this is basically old wives kind of stuff. Like, ask any matriarchal figure, and she'll basically be able to tell you all of this, because it's actually just sort of, there are some sort of essential truths about human beings, which most people will come to learn as they spend enough time in the world. And, the political project that I'm taking aim at is one that actually tries to deny those. But I think we'll always ultimately fail, because you can't fight against reality for that long and win. But I've had so many young women who will say to me, I didn't know this. This is completely new information. I had no idea. And actually feel amazingly, I mean, this was what I wanted all along, that having read someone put it down on paper gives them permission to listen to their intuitions and to not try and sort of do battle against reality anymore. I got this lovely email, for instance, from the mum of a young woman who I won't go into details, but basically the young woman had heard me on a podcast or something and had read the book, and her mum had read the book, and they'd had a conversation about it. And then the daughter had gone off to university and had a particular incident where a boy that she fancied and was hoping to have a relationship with had basically showed up at her dorm expecting casual sex and made it clear that he wasn't interested in a relationship, he just wanted to have casual sex with her. And she said previously she would have just said yes, basically to be polite, / to, in the hope, maybe
it will turn into something
like that. But she didn't. She turned him away, which is a very brave thing to do. And she said that it was because the phrase her mum used was that having read this book, she felt armed with permission.
That's so interesting, and I guess must be very gratifying to feel like
enormously
made an actual difference in a real situation.
I just thought that was such a beautiful phrase as well, armed with permission.
That's
because it's a thing about young women that, and I remember this as having once been a young woman, even an unusually contrarian one. I'm probably like 99th centile contrarianism. Young women are so desperate to please. It's something that men don't always realise. That actually young women tend to be so acutely sensitive about social status, about what people think about them, about being normal, about being nice, about being liked. It's such a sort of driving force. It's something that people tend to lose a little bit with age. You get a little bit more sort of grouchy and independent. But when you're young, that matters so much. And therefore to say, oh, well, they're consenting. Like, yeah, in a legal sense, I guess they are.
But as you said earlier, there's consent and there's sort of a fully orbed sense of what you want and what actually is the best thing for you.
Yeah.
And I just feel like perhaps that young lady sort of moved from just the quote unquote consent to something that was a bit more actually, I've recognised a bit more of the value I have, and that I don't have to just submit to something that isn't actually. I want to be a bit naughty though, because Belle, you said you don't necessarily agree with everything in the book. It sounded like you might be saying that. Can I ask you what some of those things might be, just and see what Louise has to say?
I think the answer may be really simple, because you may be saying that's not my job and that's not what you're intending to do. But I think I think there's a pitchfork where if I trace it back, because when you talk about sexual and physical violence perpetrated by men, you go very much down the evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, and sort of reject more of the sociological, very much nature versus nature, to really oversimplify it. Whereas I think naturally I would lean more towards the nature. So then anywhere that path takes you, my nature path takes me somewhere else, perhaps is sort of where I'd go with that. But my main thing is I wonder if sometimes I just wanted you to be a bit harder on men, basically.
Really? Because I have people saying the opposite.
Oh, really? I just wonder if
I'm going around saying that all men are rapists and you're Chivalry.
maybe, maybe, but sort of, that you spoke about that final chapter, Listen to Your Mother, and you end it with a set of rules for women to do their best to stay safe. And those include don't get drunk with men, what other ones where they don't go on dating apps, things like that. And so I think for me, but again, this is where you might say, but this wasn't what I was trying to do. Is that all a bit defeatist? Is that just sort of naturalising, you don't like the word patriarchy, but you know what I mean, naturalising what liberal feminists perhaps are calling patriarchy, and just saying it is the way it is. Let them, be. It's in their biological makeup. Women, this is what you need to do about it.
You're not the first to use the word defeatist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's probably the most... From the feminist side, that's probably the most common criticism.
Okay.
And I think, maybe it is a little bit. But then I also think that it comes back to that thing about sort of recognising some of these essential truths about human beings. We don't know of a society where there hasn't been sexual violence. We don't know of one where it hasn't been committed 99%-ish by men. It may be that we've flipped the coin every single time and it's come up heads. Or it may be that there is something biological that's going on as well, which is not to say there isn't some nurture. I think it's nature and nurture.
Okay.
I think that's the answer to basically every nature nurture question, is that it's both. It's always both. And I suppose so things like me advising women not to get drunk with men they don't know. Not drink, but get drunk, crucially. Which, up until, I'm told, like the 1990s, the ladder era, was completely common sense. Women wouldn't do that. It's quite a modern phenomenon to think that getting really, really sloshed in public is normal thing to do. Is because I'm very sceptical of the capacity for education to rectify millennia of sexual violence, basically. And that is pretty much the only intervention that's really offered by the sort of standard liberal feminist position, that we have consent workshops, we have sort of cultural interventions of various kinds, like modelling good behaviour on television sort of stuff. And that if we can just sort of offer a different narrative and challenge some of the moral ideas that are assumed to be behind sexual violence, then everything will sort of come right. I don't think it's bad to do those things necessarily, but I'm very sceptical of whether or not they're actually going to work. And I think that actually what you need to be thinking more about is, obviously putting sex offenders in prison. I say this, difficult thing to do, but that's a very serious project. Keeping them in prison as well, that's another complaint I have with the government. Very, very short sentences often for some really, really dangerous offenders.
Definitely.
And it's also has to, unfortunately, on a moral level, I would love it if women could do whatever they wanted. If they could get as drunk as they wanted, if they could, go out late walking alone anywhere in the world, they should be able to do that. But realistically, they can't. And we all know, the things that we say to our friends and daughters, like text me when you get home safe. We all do that.
Yeah.
We all offer this kind of advice informally, but we tend not to say it publicly. You're not supposed to sort of acknowledge that as an actual set of directives. And I guess the thing I find frustrating about that, and this probably does partly go back to working in rape crisis and meeting some girls who didn't really have the guidance that I did and that a lot of us do, is some girls have never had anyone say that to them. No one's ever said, you know, doing these things is risky, and they're not being told it publicly. And so how are they supposed to know? You know, bearing in mind as well that the peak age of victimisation, the modal age for rape victimisation is 50. It's younger than you think. So you're often dealing with women, girls, who have so little life experience and have frankly been lied to by the culture. Because I think that a lot of, you know, going back to Sex and the City or whatever, a lot of cultural representations basically pretend as if men and women are basically the same. Think also of things like superhero films or whatever, where you see this like tiny woman, 50 kilos or something, you know, knocking out this enormous man. Like even just something as basic as physical strength differences is frequently denied. And it's also something that I think people just have less experience of, maybe because maybe we have smaller families, fewer siblings, you're less likely to do rough and tumble with your brothers, you're less likely to play physical sports or do physical jobs or whatever. You really could be ignorant of quite how much of a physical advantage men have over women. If we don't tell girls this, how are they supposed to know?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why some people will come back and say, but we should expect more of men, you know. But there is also that thing in me which says, but when you've got two drunk people, that's when probably that consent education talk is not really in the forefront of someone's mind. When you've got someone basically in the heat of arousal, let's be honest, that something biological is going on, as well as, you know, and you can obviously hold people to account, but there is in a sense just the practical reality of what happens, and that there are sensible and less sensible things to do in that. I can fully understand kind of that perspective. But I think there's still, I appreciate what Belle says about, but let's not let men off the hook here, because I don't want, you know, I don't want creepy Hugh Hefners sort of doing their thing either, and, you know, without any sort of restraint on them. There's a sense in which I don't see your book as simply giving women advice about what to do, but you're also appealing to the monogamy. It makes demands on both sides, you know. It is about actually asking men to constrain themselves at some level.
And that's another critique I've had as well from feminist friends and so on, that, you know, on the one hand, I'm saying that some unknown minority of men are sexually aggressive, and particularly when they're young, and it's sort of hard to educate them out of that. It is a minority. That's the good news story. It really is a minority. Like, most men are completely safe. The problem is that if you're a woman walking out alone late at night, you have literally no idea who that is. So there's always a risk factor. But on the other hand, I'm saying, but here are, you know, here's why marriage is actually really good for women. Here's how you could, you know, various kind of social norms and structures can actually channel men in better directions. And I've had women say, no, hang on, are you really expecting, you know, Hugh Hefner, for one example, to make a great husband one day? You know, do you not think that actually sort of expecting women to form relationships with men who are actually, you know, really very horrible is a terrible thing to ask of women? And I guess I say, well, I think we're just talking about different populations who shade into one another. You know, you've got men now who, even in a culture that excuses all kinds of sexual hedonism and exploitation and whatever, still behave magnificently and still make wonderful husbands and fathers. You know, you've got those men who seem to just be sort of virtuous regardless of context. And then you've got men who probably need to be in prison for life.
Sure.
At the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. And then you've got some space in between, and it's all shades of grey. And I think, for instance, that if you say had the word I use slightly provocatively in the book is chivalry. If you had expectations placed on men, saying, well, given that you are the stronger sex, given that you have certain sort of natural advantages, it is therefore your moral obligation to behave better, even, you know, to behave more in a more sort of self-sacrificing way, all of this. I think that somewhere in that grey zone, some men would make themselves into the best husbands and fathers, and some wouldn't. And that's just life, I think. I don't think that there is a utopian option here. I think that there are better and worse incentive structures that you can put in place, and I think that our current set aren't up to the job.
That's really interesting. I think my sort of life's work, I'm too young to have a life's work, but I am so passionate about women feeling like Christianity does not need to be in any way oppressive or strip them of empowerment or anything like that, because to me, and so I've got a background in biblical studies, so I'm sort of quite narrow focused, that goes against everything that the Jesus movement was about. And I'm so interested, and I was chatting to a researcher about it just the other week, about how when Christianity first came onto the scene and it was all very grassroots and it was, you know, absolutely blowing up in certain cities, it was an absolute revolution for women.
Yeah.
And that's why it was predominantly women.
Yeah.
It was predominantly vulnerable people, and within that were women. And it was about making sure that they were safe, they were valued, they were seen, all of that sort of thing. But then what you could say is that's the Christian faith right at the beginning, right when it was bubbling up. So actually maybe it's unfair of me to even call it the Christian faith, you know, the way, the whatever. It was about, say, maybe it's similar to what you're saying, is it was about basically telling men to behave better, expecting more of them, because there's, you know, the dignity of every human being, there's value placed upon women. So it's about not using people as possessions, not exploiting people, not using and abusing people, all of that. And that's kind of similar-ish to what you're saying. Has that majorly surprised you that you come in alignment in certain ways? I'm not saying in every way with that, because that's one of the most attractive things about Christianity to me, is how empowering it is for me as a woman.
It wasn't something that I was as aware. I didn't know as much about the first sexual revolution, right? It's, you know, the Christian sexual revolution of the first century. Yeah. Until I started writing this book, and also actually subsequently I read, for instance, Kyle Harper's writing. Yeah. And I mean, I should say, I mean, I call myself Christian agnostic. Anyone who's raised in this culture obviously is deeply has Christianity deep in their bones.
Tom Holland, well, thank you for that.
Who's another, right? Yes.
Another guest on this podcast.
Yes. And so I'm sure to some extent that was sort of in the background for me. I mean, just the idea that women's vulnerability is not something to be despised, but is something to be protected. That is basically a fundamentally Christian idea. Is not something that, you know, the Romans thought, for instance.
No.
And the idea that, say, the idea that, say, a slave woman's sexual violation is abhorrent. Again, that is an idea that comes with Christianity and was absolutely not by any means universally recognised in the ancient world, or indeed in, you know, very many other cultures. And that, yeah, I think is fundamental to feminism. I mean, I actually have a long essay about this coming up recently, which I think I'll get in a lot of trouble for, but I really do think that feminism comes out of Christianity. Feminism is completely reliant on Christian moral principles. And I think that feminists who set themselves up in opposition to Christianity, you know, the Handmaid's Tale kind of representation of this sort of, I mean, people forget that the Handmaid's Tale was really written about the Iranian Revolution, but the imagery from the TV show and so on is all about Puritanism and sort of setting up Christianity as the bogeyman. I think that view completely misses the legacy of Christianity that is still very evident within feminism. And I think that actually feminists who set themselves up in opposition to Christianity, this is particularly true in America, where obviously Christian right is much more sort of fierce and forced, are soaring off the branch on which they sit. Because actually, if you really sort of, the process of de-Christianization that starts in the 1960s, doesn't start, it accelerates in the 1960s, it starts earlier than that. I mean, even in the 19th century, you've got falling away of Christian belief, right? That's what Matthew Arnold was writing about in Dover Beach. But in the 1960s, you have that sharp acceleration. And I think it's Tom Holland who's described this as being something like a second Reformation. Like that's how big an historical event it is. And I am extremely nervous about what full de-Christianization means. And I don't think enough people think about what it actually means. Because I think so many secular progressives don't realise quite how deeply Christian their thinking is. And they don't realise quite how unique actually the set of ideas inherited of Christianity are in terms of, say, you know, the radical sort of spiritual equality of men and women and of rich and poor, and the fact that vulnerable people shouldn't be exploited, they should be protected. You know, these kind of really fundamental ideas. What we call human rights in a silly kind of, you know, they're not human rights. They are a culturally unique concept.
Theological premises.
Yeah. I think that there are lots of things, this is what my upcoming essay for First Things is about. I think that there are lots of things that feminists can quite rightly feel very sort of dismayed at within Christianity, for the abortion being the big one.
Mm-hmm.
That is the big one. And that's why, of course, it's such a big issue in America in particular.
Yeah.
And that's so much, and that's why women show up dressed in handmaids' outfits in protest of dogs and so on. I also think that the abortion was a live political issue in the first century, and infanticide was a live political issue in the first century. And that was actually one of the main ways in which, you know, Christians going to rubbish heaps and rescuing exposed infants was a feature of the early church. I don't think that you can have a religion which sees vulnerability as valuable to the extent that Christianity does, without reaching the conclusion that the unborn child also is worthy of protection. I don't think you can do that. And the problem, therefore, with trying to make arguments in favour of abortion that are not, you know, protecting the health of the mother, or in terrible cases of tragedy, you know, there sometimes has to be sort of, you can defend abortion, I think, in sort of self-defence terms, and say that there are some situations in which it would be legitimate for someone to kill in self-defence, for instance. That I think that's fine. The problem is when you start making arguments in defence of abortion, when you say things like the fetus is just a parasite, it's like having a wisdom tooth removed. You know, there is no moral meaning whatsoever in this. That, I think, is when you're getting to the point where you say, okay, if you're trying to do away with this moral principle that vulnerability is valuable and worthy of protection, where next? Because feminism, it depends on that idea. What is to stop men, you know, re-paganized men, right, in some completely de-Christianized future, turning around and saying, but hang on, women are small and weak and made smaller and weaker by pregnancy and childbirth. Why on earth should you have the same political value as men do? Which has been the conclusion reached by many societies. You know, I think that I don't think that anti-Christian feminists have thought it completely through.
It's a bit like the disenchantment again. Strip meaning away from everything and see where it takes you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way, everything you've said makes perfect sense. At the same time, it sounds so odd because if you say that, you know, there are so many feminists who haven't understood the Christian roots of where their own feminism came from and now stand essentially against, you know, traditional Christian sort of, you know, views on sexuality and so on. And to that extent, if you run into anything, you will run into sort of, you know, potentially very valid critiques of the way the Christian church has sometimes handled things. You know, the kind of places that women were put who had children out of wedlock. You know, in Ireland and so on. You know, there are documentaries coming out. There are things. So it's not as though Christendom has some sort of perfect record on this, right?
No, it's not from it.
So you can understand why there are people who are saying, look what Christianity did. Are we better off without that sort of puritanical, you know, Victorian era sort of? But are you saying that it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater to sort of rail against that and not realise that with the good that came, there were obviously going to be, I suppose, the things that weren't good as well?
I think there may be only so many ways of structuring an enormously complex civilization. And I think that trying to construct the sort of new atheist project, of trying to construct an entirely rationalist, secular sort of guiding philosophy for society, I think it's proved to be an abject failure. I mean, what we've learned, I think, in the last 20 years, post-new atheism, is that when people don't have religion, they just turn politics into religion, and it actually makes politics much worse.
People are less religious in a sense; they just get religious about other things.
Exactly, and I'd say in a more dysfunctional way, and often lose the good bits of religion, like community and whatever, and hold on to some of the more dysfunctional bits. So I sort of think that if you are trying to come up with philosophy or institutions or whatever which best protects people's interests, you have to actually find some real examples that have really worked. I don't think it's possible to just design something on the back of an envelope and think you can impose this on people and it's going to be great. I think what you have to do is actually look around at all societies that exist now and have ever existed and say, they seem to do it well, they seem to do it well, they do it less well. It has to be operating actually within the real lived world. And, we've never had a society that didn't have religion in some way. I think the idea that you can just lose it is for the birds. The question, I think, is just pick your poison, really. And I think that what we're seeing now, as Christianity recedes, is not a transition to, the rationalist utopia imagined by new atheism. It's actually something much more pagan. I think that in many ways what we're returning to is something that obviously, many differences. We're talking about thousands of year gap here, but something that actually looks a lot more like Roman religion.
Interesting.
With potentially some of the moral ideas that come with that.
I guess my sort of question as we start to wrap this up is, you've painted to some extent a rather bleak picture in the book of where we're at, but you have some stories that seem kind of hopeful, that you've kind of given some people a sense of their own meaningfulness and that they can take control again of their decisions and that sort of thing. Do you see hope? Do you think we're kind of going to be living in this sort of morass of kind of materialistic views on sexuality, pornography coming on every screen of a young person, or do you think the pendulum will swing? People will kind of learn we can't keep living this way, that we weren't designed, in a sense, whether you think that's biologically or spiritually, to live this way. What do you think the future might look like in that sense?
I think there is probably a backlash already underway, and partly because people keep asking me if I think there is one, and given that everyone keeps talking about it all the time, that sort of suggests it is happening a bit. I guess it's something that's happening, maybe. And also because that is generally what you do see historically. You tend to see this kind of roller coaster between periods of licentiousness and prudishness and whatever. So it would make sense. That tends to be how humans work. So that you would expect that. I guess the difference now is, of course, that our technological landscape is completely different, because we have the pill and we have the internet and we have all these other things that our ancestors didn't have. So that's obviously going to change things. I mean, the hopeful point is that people do still have the ability to behave differently. You can just not watch porn. You can get married. You cannot have casual sex. Like, it's difficult. And I think, and I don't want to just do that crude sort of you have absolute agency, on your way thing, because we know that actually agency is severely constrained, and that everything that we're dealing with, shades of grey and trade-offs or whatever, but people can choose differently. They can. There is some scope for individual autonomy, and people are already doing that, at small scale. And I guess what happens, change happens among individuals in small rooms.
Yes.
And then eventually that scales.
So you see, sort of, if we're talking about the re-enchanting of sex, of the sexual revolution, you see that happening bottom up rather than top down.
I mean, that's an interesting question, whether it's a sort of... I don't know about the socioeconomics of it. I wonder if what might be happening to some extent is that the sexual counter-revolution is sort of an elite thing in the way that the sexual revolution actually was, or at least trickled down to some extent. Definitely elite ideas. That might happen again. I don't know. It definitely isn't coming from business interests or whatever. I mean, this is definitely, this is a very core theme in my book, that I think a lot of what's driving this is capitalism. And when people are resisting it, they tend to be sort of pushing against the market, which is, I think, to be applauded. And I think individuals acting against those kind of fast forces is to be applauded. But I don't know. It's all to play for.
All to play for. I am really intrigued, actually, because I do feel like there's a little shift, and I'm intrigued to see where that bubbles up, how it changes things, what pushback is to it, or actually if, a bit like you've encountered with your book, people will want to disagree with it more than they do actually disagree with it. But we better, as much as I want to talk to you for hours and hours, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing to chat to you.
Yeah, it's been a really, really interesting conversation. Thank you. If you want more from Louise, do check out the links with today's show. You can find her book, and you've got a podcast and video channel as well, where you're doing some really interesting interviews and things at the moment. And I think there's another book on the horizon. Is that true? That we may yet see a sequel?
I'm supposed to finish the proposal tomorrow.
Yeah, so it's a watch this space situation.
It's on its way.
We'll
Yes.
get you back maybe once it's published, and so you can tell us about it. But thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you.